I didn't cry when he said it. I can't believe I gave up everything for you, and you destroyed my career. His voice wasn't loud. It was the calm, measured kind of angry. The kind that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. I stood there holding his dry-cleaned suit in one hand, keys in the other, heart somewhere between disbelief and that sick, steady calm I get when something breaks inside me. He didn't know that 10 minutes earlier, I had found the documents he thought were locked away. He didn't know I'd already called the lawyer. My name is Claire Emerson. I'm 32. For most of my life, I thought being the reasonable one, the composed one, the helper, was something to be proud of. I built a life on emotional control. On saying I'm fine when I wasn't. On listening more than I spoke, waiting for people to come around. That night, standing in the entryway of our home, I realized I had mistaken silence for strength. And that had cost me more than I knew. That night, I stopped being the woman who absorbs. And started becoming the woman who acts. When I married Daniel 5 years ago, I knew he came from a family that expected women to support, not lead. They didn't say it outright. They just smiled when I talked about my job and changed the subject to his. Daniel was a high school guidance counselor when we met. Smart, gentle, charming in the way men are when they've never had to scream to be heard. He had opinions about everything but made you feel like yours mattered more. I mistook that for kindness. For partnership. We married after 18 months. A quiet ceremony at the courthouse. I wore a pale blue dress and carried my grandmother's clutch. My mother warned me not to give up too much. He seems lovely, she said. But don't disappear. I laughed. You know me, Mom. I couldn't disappear if I tried. But that's exactly what I did. At first, it was small things. I offered to cover more rent when he wanted to go part-time and finish his second degree. I cooked dinner every night because his schedule was mentally draining. I canceled a weekend trip with friends because his mother was in town and wanted just family. Daniel used to say I was his anchor. I think now he meant it literally. I kept him from floating away, and from doing anything that would require real friction with the world. Then the promotion came. I'd spent 4 years climbing the ranks at my firm, working late nights, making myself indispensable without ever appearing ambitious. When I was named managing partner of the compliance division, Daniel took me out to dinner, ordered champagne, and said, "Well, now I can really focus on my writing." I remember laughing. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He quit his job 2 months later. "It's not forever," he said. "Just until I finish the manuscript." He wanted to write a book about educational trauma in public schools. I supported it. Of course I did. That's what you do when you believe in someone. You give them the gift of time. And time is exactly what he took. A year passed. Then another. His book changed titles 3 times. Then genres. At one point, it became a screenplay. He worked in coffee shops, took meetings with other creatives, came home tired from all the thinking. I paid the mortgage, utilities, groceries. I smiled at parties when people asked what Daniel was working on. I covered his overdraft fees. Then came the day he blamed me. He had applied for a fellowship at a private research foundation, a prestigious, well-funded program for writers. I'd helped him with the application, reviewed every line. He didn't get in. And somehow, that became my fault. He stood in our kitchen, jaw tight, arms crossed, saying, "You don't get it. You've never had to create anything from nothing. Your world is rules and checklists. Mine needs space. And you've turned this house into a cage." I said nothing. He kept going. "You know what? I think you've resented me this whole time. You say you support me, but deep down, you want me to fail." That's when I realized, he believed it. That his failure wasn't his own. That I had ruined his career. That his comfort, his ego, his vision of himself as a future best-selling author, mattered more than the fact I had been keeping us afloat for 4 years. That was also the moment I stopped seeing him as my partner. I started seeing him as a project I'd outgrown. 2 weeks later, while searching for a file on our shared home computer, I found a folder I didn't recognize. Inside were scans of financial documents, contracts, a second bank account in his name, one with tens of thousands of dollars in it, and wire transfers, monthly, for almost a year. The sender? His ex-fiancé's father. The same man who, according to Daniel, had hated his guts and cut him off forever. It wasn't hard to put it together. Daniel had been taking money behind my back. Not working on a book. Not applying for jobs. Just living off the kindness of a man he'd sworn to despise. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just shrugged and said, "I didn't think you'd understand." That's when I knew what I had to do. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't leave that night. I waited. I planned. And when I finally acted, I made sure it would be quiet and permanent. What he didn't know, what no one in our life knew, was that I had my own secrets too. And his name wasn't the only one on those documents. I opened a drawer in my home office, pulled out the envelope I'd sealed months ago, and ran my finger across the edge. The time had come. I wasn't going to confront him. I was going to unmake him. Some betrayals don't bleed. They calcify. The deeper they cut, the quieter you become. I remember once, years ago, my grandmother told me, "There's strength in a woman who knows how to wait." The world underestimates her. Until it's too late. She was the only person who ever truly understood me. Her name was June. She had hands like weathered silk and eyes that saw through people without ever making them flinch. The house I grew up in was loud, messy, full of tension, the kind that never quite breaks the surface but hangs in the air like humidity. Grandma June's place was the opposite. Her silence was deliberate. Sacred. She taught me to peel apples with a paring knife so the skin came off in one long ribbon. To iron pillowcases. To hold my temper the way you hold a full teacup, carefully, with both hands, even if it burns. She also taught me the importance of keeping copies of everything. When she passed, she left me a small cedar box. No letter. Just one key taped to the underside of the lid, and a folded scrap of paper with a single line. "Protect what's yours, quietly." It took me years to understand what she meant. But when I found Daniel's secret bank account, I felt that understanding settle in my bones like an old instinct returning. Not anger. Not grief. Just clarity. I didn't confront him that night. Or the next. Instead, I moved carefully. I started documenting. Screenshots, timestamps, digital backups. I emailed copies to a burner address. Cleared my browser history. Deleted the folder from the desktop and replaced it with a decoy resume I knew he'd never open. I also stopped asking him questions. That alone gave me more power than I expected. Daniel thrived on being the victim. On explaining things. On being interrupted so he could correct you. But silence? My silence? That unnerved him. He began hovering. Asking if everything was okay. Suggesting we take a weekend trip to reset. He made dinner one night. Badly. The salmon was overcooked and dry. I said thank you. He stared at me for a long time, as if trying to read my tone like Braille. I didn't give him anything. Instead, I began thinking about legacy. It's a word people throw around as if it belongs only to the wealthy. But to me, it meant something different. Legacy was about what you leave behind that isn't physical. What parts of yourself remain when your name is no longer mentioned? Grandma June had no fortune, but she left behind something better. She left a way of thinking. A quiet pride in self-sufficiency. An understanding that womanhood wasn't about sacrifice, it was about sovereignty. And somewhere along the way, I had surrendered mine. The thing is, I never really wanted to be the one in charge. Not out of fear. Just preference. I liked shared weight. Shared decisions. I liked the idea of a life built together, not around one person's vision. That's what I thought marriage was. But Daniel had mistaken my softness for subservience. My support for surrender. And slowly, methodically, he'd made sure I stayed small. It became clear the money he was receiving wasn't just a favor. The monthly transfers came from a non-profit board where his ex-fiancée's father served as chair. The same board where Daniel had once interned during his undergrad years. There were memos attached. Language about consulting, internal memos, and creative asset management. It was a front. He wasn't just lying to me. He was laundering his self-image through other people's generosity. Worse, I found out he had listed our home, my home, bought with my salary alone, as collateral on a private investment application for a startup incubator he never told me about. A wellness brand. Something to do with cognitive clarity drinks for tech entrepreneurs. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was theft. I didn't sleep much that week. My body would shut down for a few hours at a time, but my brain stayed on. I stopped wearing my ring. Not because of some dramatic decision, but because it started to feel foreign. Like I was wearing someone else's story on my hand. I started calling in favors. Quiet ones. A friend from college who worked in forensic accounting agreed to review the files I found. She didn't ask too many questions. Just said, "Send it encrypted." I did. Another friend, Grace, a lawyer I met years ago during a compliance audit, took me out for lunch. We talked about old cases, mutual contacts. Then she handed me a napkin with 3 names scribbled in ink. "No paper trail," she said. "If you need help, these are who you call." I kept the napkin in my wallet. Daniel started asking questions again. More insistent this time. He said, "You've been distant." I replied, "I've been busy." He said, "We need to talk." I said, "So talk." But he didn't. He was waiting for me to flinch. To give him a scene he could manage. An outburst to shift the blame. When none came, he changed tactics. He offered to go back to work part-time. Said maybe things had gotten too comfortable. Asked if I wanted to try couples therapy. I nodded. Smiled slightly. Said we'd look into it. Then I added another name to the list. That week, I had a locksmith change the code on the front door. Claimed there was a break-in a few blocks over. Daniel agreed it was a good idea. He didn't know I'd disabled his access. I also called our bank and separated the accounts. Legally, everything was already in my name. But Daniel had a supplementary card. I canceled it. Ordered a new one. Changed passwords, updated emergency contacts, and scheduled a meeting with my firm's HR department. I requested a private office. Cited confidential client work and got approval within 48 hours. Daniel was losing access. Bit by bit. Piece by piece. I started dressing differently too. Not for him. For myself. Softer fabrics. Fewer layers. No more armor. I didn't need it anymore. I realized something then: when women stop protecting people who don't protect them, the world labels them cold. Difficult. Dangerous. But the truth is, we've just stopped bleeding for people who never deserved our blood in the first place. The last night before everything shifted, Daniel left for a late dinner with an old colleague. I knew the colleague. Knew he didn't live in town. Knew it was a lie. But I said nothing. Instead, I stood in the kitchen, fingers pressed to the edge of the counter, breathing in the stillness of my own composure. The envelope I had sealed weeks ago sat on the table. Inside were copies of the financial records, the contract Daniel had falsified, and a signed affidavit from my friend in accounting verifying the inconsistencies. Next to it, a second envelope. My terms. No threats. No dramatic ultimatums. Just math. Assets. Timelines. A formal separation agreement with clauses that would protect my credit, my property, my future. He would find it in the morning. But that night, I sat in bed, lights off, listening to the sound of the lock turning downstairs. His footsteps. His bag dropping to the floor. A deep sigh. He didn't come upstairs. Instead, I heard the fridge open. The faint clink of a wine bottle. Then the silence of a man avoiding something he could already feel happening. I closed my eyes and imagined the way he'd look when he read my letter. Not shocked. Not angry. Just smaller. Because some men only know who they are when someone else is holding them up. And I was done being the foundation. Some wounds don't scream. They whisper, relentlessly, until you start to believe them. I hadn't expected the silence to ache more than the betrayal itself. Daniel didn't mention the envelope when he came upstairs the next morning. He moved around our bedroom like everything was fine. His tone was cheerful. Too cheerful. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said no. He didn't press. That was how I knew he'd read it. The quiet was his defense. Pretend nothing changed, and maybe it hadn't. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I'd overreacted, misunderstood, misjudged. That's how pressure works in families like ours. It doesn't arrive in screams. It settles in softly, like humidity. It asks you to doubt yourself. Then it waits for you to apologize for noticing. By the third day, Daniel began to change tactics again. He started making calls on speakerphone in the kitchen. Loud conversations with no one in particular. Ideas for a podcast. A possible consulting role. Something about a creative agency that wanted him to revamp their onboarding model. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. But I listened. Carefully. The desperation in his voice was obvious. He wasn't working. He was performing work. For me. The house began to feel like a stage, and I was the audience he needed to convince. That weekend, his mother called me. She had never been particularly warm. Pleasant, yes. Polite, always. But not warm. That Saturday, her voice was coated in syrup. She said, "Claire, I know Daniel's been a little scattered lately. He's just under a lot of pressure." He said, "You've been distant?" I answered, "I've been occupied." A pause. Then she said something I didn't expect. "He told me he thinks you're having a breakdown." There it was. The shift. The new narrative. Not about him. About me. I let the silence hang. She said, "You know we love you. You've always been so strong. But strength can fracture too, Claire. I think you should talk to someone. Just in case. Just in case." Like I was glassware with a hairline crack, waiting to shatter. I thanked her for the call and hung up. 2 hours later, Daniel came home with tulips. Not roses, he knew I hated those. Too obvious, too loud. Tulips were the apology flower. The forgive me without the drama flower. He placed them in a vase and set them on the counter. Said nothing. That night, he made dinner again. He poured wine. He played jazz. The whole production. I let him perform. I knew what he was doing. He wasn't trying to fix us. He was building a case. A few days later, I started receiving text messages from his friends. Casual check-ins. One from a woman named Elise, a friend from his graduate program. "Hey Claire, just checking in. Daniel mentioned you've been under a lot of stress. Let me know if you ever want to talk." Another from his old roommate, Evan. "Heard things are tense. Daniel's worried about you. Just remember, he loves you. He's just trying to hold things together." The messages weren't for support. They were witnesses. And suddenly, I wasn't just dealing with Daniel. I was dealing with the machinery he'd quietly set in motion: whispers to friends, gentle nudges to family, a carefully constructed narrative designed to make me the unstable one. It was subtle, but effective. By the end of the week, I'd received 3 calls from mutual friends asking if I needed a break, if I'd considered taking some time off work. One of them even offered to drive me to a wellness retreat. Just for a weekend, she said. Just to reset. It wasn't kindness. It was containment. Daniel was repositioning me. Not as his betrayer, but as his burden. It was brilliant, in a way. He had realized he couldn't defend his actions. So he reframed the story. He became the husband trying to care for his troubled wife. It hit me one night, while brushing my teeth, how much work it takes to unravel a person's credibility without ever raising your voice. And how little it takes to make others believe you. Especially when you're charming. Especially when you're a man. I called Grace. I asked if she could expedite the separation papers. She said yes. But she paused before hanging up. She said, "Claire, are you safe?" I replied, "I'm not in danger. Just surrounded." I knew she understood. That weekend, I left the city. I told Daniel I had a conference. He nodded, offered to pack snacks for the road. He said, "Take all the time you need." He didn't ask where I was going. Because he already believed he knew. But I didn't go to a hotel. I went to a small house on the edge of Lake Marlow, owned by my godmother. No phone signal. No internet. Just space. Space to think. I brought a notebook. I made a list. Not of what Daniel had done, but of who I had become while he did it. The compromises. The silences. The small humiliations I'd allowed to accumulate like rust. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the betrayal. It was the erosion. Of self. Of agency. Of dignity. That's what I wanted back, not revenge. Not justice. Just my own reflection, unclouded by his shadow. I stayed 3 days. On the last morning, I wrote a single sentence in the center of the page. I am not a character in his story. When I came back, Daniel greeted me with coffee and croissants. He said, "You look better." I replied, "I feel clear." He smiled. Like I had returned to him. What he didn't realize was that I had returned to myself. 3 days later, Grace called. The documents were ready. All I had to do was sign. And deliver them. I planned it for Friday morning. But something happened on Thursday night. I opened my inbox and found an email from Daniel. It was addressed to a woman I didn't recognize. But he'd accidentally CC'd me. The subject line was short, "She's cracking. Give it another week." There was no body text. Just that one line. No attachments. No explanation. Just confirmation. That everything I feared was real. That I was never crazy. Just cornered. Some truths arrive like thunder. Others like a door clicking shut behind you. The email had no explanation. Just that line, "She's cracking. Give it another week." It could have been anyone's sentence, written in jest or strategy or something in between. But I knew it wasn't neutral. It was weaponized patience. I didn't reply. I didn't confront. I didn't even breathe for a few moments. Then I closed the laptop and stared at my own hands, still steady, still mine. For a long time, that's all I did. Watch my fingers resting gently on the wood of the desk, like they were waiting for a cue I hadn't given yet. The next morning, I began the real work. I moved methodically. With intention. The way Grandma June used to fold linen napkins, careful, sharp, knowing each crease had a purpose. I withdrew the full amount from our joint savings account. Legally, it was mine, technically and practically. My income had funded it. Daniel had only contributed illusions and IOUs. The bank teller didn't flinch. Just counted the slips, handed me the receipt, and said, "Anything else today?" I replied, "Not yet." I closed the account that afternoon. Moved everything to a new one, different institution, different branch. Everything under my name alone. I contacted Grace and told her I wanted to update the separation agreement. Add a clause barring Daniel from financial claims for emotional distress. She agreed, said she'd have it filed by end of day. Then I called the firm where Daniel had tried to apply for the fellowship last year, the one he blamed me for losing. I asked for the director. Said it was a professional follow-up. He was polite. Said he remembered Daniel well. Then paused. He submitted 2 letters of recommendation. One was clearly plagiarized. The other, well, we traced it back. Turned out it was written by an AI program. A basic one, too. Frankly, it felt more like a prank than a serious application. I thanked him. Not for the information. For the validation. That evening, Daniel cooked again. Chicken marsala. Wine poured. Jazz playing low from his playlist. The performance was growing thinner. The edges frayed. I watched him move around the kitchen like a man rehearsing something he didn't believe in anymore. He said, "You've been quiet lately." I answered, "I've been thinking." He waited, expecting more. I gave him nothing. He ate quickly. Watched me while I picked at my food. He looked tired. Not emotionally. Strategically. Like someone trying to win a game that kept changing rules. After dinner, I slipped the envelope into my tote bag. The same one I used every day for work. Nothing theatrical. No dramatic exit. Just business as usual. The next morning, I left before sunrise. I drove to Grace's office downtown. Parked in the visitor lot. Sat in the car for a few minutes. Then I walked in, signed the final documents, and handed over the packet I had prepared. Emails. Financial records. Screenshots of the message he never meant for me to see. Grace didn't ask what I wanted her to do with them. She knew. Daniel had always assumed I wouldn't fight. Not because I was weak, but because I was decent. Because I hated spectacle. Because I'd rather suffer privately than wound publicly. He wasn't wrong. But he forgot something. Even quiet women have a line. And when we cross it, we don't come back with noise. We come back with receipts. That afternoon, I visited the notary. Signed the final affidavit for the financial inquiry. The woman behind the counter barely looked up. "You sure about all this?" I replied, "Yes." Then I went home. Daniel was there. On the couch. Watching something. A documentary, I think. He paused it when I walked in. He said, "You okay?" I nodded. "Just tired," I said. He smiled, relieved. As if that meant something had passed. That I was softening. That his performance was working. I let him believe it. The next day, the private investigator called. I'd hired him 2 weeks earlier, quietly. A man referred by Grace's colleague. Discreet. Ethical, but thorough. "Your husband," he said, "has been meeting with someone. Regularly. Her name is Anika. She works for the nonprofit board." I already knew that. "But here's the part you should know," he continued. "They've been meeting at a co-working space. Registered under a Shell LLC. Documents show she's listed as managing partner. But the funds? All traced back to your husband's secondary account." He paused. "The account he tried to hide from you." He didn't need to explain. Daniel hadn't just taken money behind my back. He'd been funneling it into a project. A business. In her name. with my signature on the loan application. A forgery. I thanked him. Asked for the file. Transferred the final payment. The next part was harder. I contacted my firm's internal legal team. Asked for a private meeting. Explained, calmly, that someone had used my digital signature on a fraudulent application tied to a wellness startup in my name. I showed them the paperwork. The chain of custody. The date stamps. They listened. Took notes. Promised to handle it discreetly. I knew they would. Reputation matters in my field. Integrity even more so. And mine had been tampered with. Grace called later that week. It's moving faster than expected, she said. He's already trying to file a claim for shared assets. But your name is clean. Your finances are clean. The forgery? That's leverage. I asked if we could settle quickly. She said yes. But added, he's going to fight. Not for the money. For the story. Daniel didn't want reconciliation. He wanted redemption. He wanted to be seen as the man trying. The man wronged by a cold, unfeeling wife. The man who sacrificed everything for a woman who couldn't love him enough. I was done with that narrative. So I gave him one final chance. 2 days later, I asked him to meet me at the park. Neutral ground. No legal papers. No drama. He wore a soft sweater and that smile, the one he used to use on new friends, on baristas, on people he needed to charm. We sat on a bench near the pond. Ducks floated past us like witnesses. I said, I know everything. He tilted his head. He said, know what? I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see someone who had hurt me. I saw someone who had made a choice. Many choices. Each one small. Each one deliberate. Each one believing I'd never leave. I opened my bag. Took out a manila envelope. Set it on the bench between us. He didn't touch it. Just stared. I said, you forged my name. He said nothing. I said, you took money in someone else's name. Built a business using funds you didn't earn. Lied to people who trusted you. Still, he said nothing. Just breathed. That was the last time we spoke. I stood. Walked away. Left the envelope on the bench. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That night, I changed the locks. Again. The next morning, I filed the final paperwork. Asset protection. Restraining order. And a formal investigation request. It wasn't revenge. It was protocol. The kind they taught me in business school. How to protect your capital when a liability becomes active. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it arrives dressed in paperwork. The envelope I left on the bench was never returned. But it did its job. Within 24 hours, Daniel's tone changed. The man who'd spent weeks positioning himself as the abandoned husband started emailing me with subject lines like urgent, please clarify, and eventually, let's be civil. Civil, after everything. Civil, now that the audience was gone and the curtain was falling. I responded through Grace. No direct contact. That was the rule now. He didn't like that. Not because he missed me. Because it made him irrelevant. Men like Daniel aren't afraid of being left. They're afraid of being edited out. He pushed back, of course. Filed a response claiming he was entitled to emotional compensation and contributions made in the form of creative labor. I let Grace handle it. She included the forged signature in her reply. That shut down the negotiation phase. We moved into enforcement. By then, the investigator had finished his report. It was meticulous. Transaction logs, timestamps, surveillance photos. Copies of communications between Daniel and Anika that proved not only intent, but premeditation. They had been setting up this business for over a year. A soft launch was scheduled for spring. The co-working space lease was already signed. There were email drafts to potential investors, using my name as a silent partner. Silent. The irony. I submitted everything to the authorities. No press. No drama. Just formal language and scanned attachments. Grace filed the restraining order the same week. It was temporary at first, but it served its purpose. Daniel was legally barred from entering our home or contacting me directly. If he needed something, he had to go through my lawyer. It took the oxygen out of him. His charm didn't work on legal boundaries. There was no loophole for charisma. That's when the calls started. From his friends. His mother. She said, "Claire, this is all so extreme. I'm sure if you two just talked." I replied, "We did." She said, "He's devastated." I said, "So was I." The call stopped after that. But one message did come through. A voicemail, from an unknown number. His voice, shaky, worn thin. "You didn't have to ruin me." I played it once. Then deleted it. Because the truth is, I hadn't ruined him. He had done that all on his own. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity finish the work. At the firm, my supervisors handled everything quietly. HR conducted their internal review. The compliance division cleared my name of any connection to Daniel's fraud. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. I'd built a reputation over a decade, disciplined, ethical, sharp. Daniel was just a name on a screen to them. An error. A loose thread. He was removed from their databases within 72 hours. Anika, I later learned, resigned from the nonprofit board quietly. No press release. No scandal. Just an empty chair and a new name added a week later. The startup they were planning? Dissolved. The registered LLC? Closed. The investment capital? Frozen. All of it, gone. There was no confrontation scene. No dramatic courtroom showdown. Just documents. Just deadlines. Just silence. And in that silence, I began to breathe again. I had dinner with Grace the following Friday. We sat by the window of a small Italian restaurant we used to go to years ago. She ordered wine. I didn't. Still couldn't bring myself to blur the edges. She raised her glass anyway. She said, "To clean exits." I didn't clink. Just nodded. I replied, "To endings that matter." She smiled. The kind of smile women give each other when they understand there's nothing left to fix. I moved out of the house the next week. It wasn't an emotional decision. It was logistical. The house had become a place of noise. Ghosts in the walls. I didn't want to disinfect the memories. I wanted to start somewhere without any. I packed methodically. No crying. No nostalgia. Just folded clothes and labeled boxes. I left behind the wedding china. The books we pretended to read together. The art prints he chose because they felt intellectual. He could keep it all. That house had been curated for his self-image anyway. I took what mattered, my grandmother's cedar box, the linen she taught me to fold, and the notebooks where I had written the details of everything he thought I would forget. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment near the lake. Small. Clean. Mine. No shared passwords. No passive aggression disguised as concern. Just space. And light. Daniel tried one last time. Grace forwarded the letter to me, as a courtesy. Handwritten. 3 pages. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance. He said he was processing, that he never intended to hurt me, that he was confused and overwhelmed and deeply regretful if anything he did made me feel unsafe. If. Made me feel. He didn't sign his name at the end. Just wrote, "Still yours, somehow." I shredded it. Not because it made me angry, but because it didn't. That's when I knew the spell was broken. The woman who once checked his schedule before booking a massage. The woman who rearranged flights to accommodate his creative moods. The woman who defended him when friends rolled their eyes. She was gone. And the one who remained? She didn't need revenge. She just needed silence. The morning the final papers were processed, Grace texted me a single word, done. I stood on my apartment balcony, holding my coffee in both hands. The sky was overcast, but clean. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I just felt leveled. Like the noise had finally stopped. Like the floor was finally still. And then, like breath returning, I began to think about what came next. Not in the way Daniel would. Not a rebranding. Not a reinvention. Just a return. To myself. To the quiet. To the woman who once peeled apples in perfect spirals, and folded linen with edges sharp as her mind. Some endings don't come with fireworks. Just a quiet click of the door behind you, and the sound of your own breath, steady and unbroken. When Grace texted me done, I didn't cry. I didn't feel the rush people describe when justice is served or when they finally win. There was no parade in my chest, no triumphant music. Just the stillness of a room that finally stopped spinning. And beneath that stillness, relief. Not because I was free of him, but because I was free of defending myself. I let the world think what it wanted. Some people fell quiet. Others distanced themselves, politely. There were murmurs, I'm sure. But they never reached me directly. That was intentional. I changed my number. Updated only the people who mattered. People who didn't begin conversations with, "But have you talked to him?" I left the firm 2 weeks later. It wasn't because of shame. It was strategy. I had built my reputation brick by brick, year by year. But my name had started to mean that woman whose husband, instead of just Claire. I didn't want to explain. And more importantly, I didn't want to be explained. So I called the managing director of a private fund in Boston. Someone I'd helped navigate a messy international deal 3 years ago. Someone who had once said, "If you ever want out, call me." I called. The next week, I signed a new contract, less hours, better boundaries, full autonomy. They even offered me temporary relocation housing. A furnished condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and views of the Charles River. I took it. Boston felt clean. Like fresh linen. I didn't throw a farewell party. I didn't post an update on social media. I just packed the few things that mattered, Grandma June's box, the tulip-shaped mug from my old kitchen, and the notebook that held my first list. The one I wrote at Lake Marlowe. I reread it on the flight. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. But it stunned me how clear my thinking had been then, how even in the thick of deception, I still knew the shape of myself. That night, in my new place, I didn't unpack. I sat on the floor, drinking tea, watching the lights of the city pulse against the glass. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not even Grace. It was selfish, maybe. But I needed a moment of complete anonymity. To exist without history. In the morning, I ran along the river path. It was still cool out, and the sidewalks were quiet. No one looked at me like I was someone they pitied. I wasn't Daniel's wife. I was no one. And for the first time, that felt like a gift. I met my new team that afternoon. They were sharp, efficient, mostly younger. No one asked about my last role. They only wanted to know what I thought of a pending acquisition deal and how I'd handle the risk margins. I gave them my answer. And just like that, I wasn't a story anymore. I was a strategist. That weekend, I finally unpacked. Slowly. Each item carefully placed. I hung no photos. Bought no rugs. It wasn't a home yet. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a pause. A clean one. Daniel did try one last time. Through legal channels. He filed an appeal, claiming emotional distress, career damage, reputational harm. Grace called me as soon as it landed. She said, "He's testing your silence." I asked what our options were. She said, "You can ignore it and let it die. Or counterfile. We have enough." I thought about it. For a whole day. Then I told her, "Let it die." Because that's what it was. Dead. The appeal never went anywhere. Just another limp attempt at control dressed up as grievance. Daniel had become what he feared most, irrelevant. The irony was, he had every opportunity to rebuild. To move forward. But instead, he kept reaching backward. Grasping at a version of me that no longer existed. One night, months later, I received a letter from a former colleague of his. A woman I barely knew. She worked in PR. I heard what happened. I just wanted to say. I wish someone had warned me before I signed on to one of his projects. You probably saved more than just yourself. I read it twice. Then placed it in the cedar box, next to Grandma June's note. I didn't need gratitude. But it was proof that quiet strength echoes. Even when you don't speak. I started writing again. Not journals. Just reflections. A habit I'd abandoned years ago when life got loud. Every morning, 20 minutes. No edits. Just truth. It was strange how much came out once I stopped filtering for kindness. I wrote about erasure. About the ways women become scaffolding for the ambitions of others. About soft betrayals and how silence becomes survival. And I wrote about coming back. Not like a phoenix. Not in flames. But like water returning to its original shape. There were days I missed the routine. Not him, just the framework of life with another body in the house. The noises, the decisions, even the compromises. But then I'd remember the weight of pretending. How much effort it took to maintain a version of peace that wasn't real. And I'd let the quiet wash over me again. One morning, while organizing files on my new work computer, I came across a scanned contract. Not related to Daniel. Just business. But in the margins, I noticed a familiar phrase, silent partner. It hit me differently this time. I used to think it meant invisibility. Now, I realized, it was power. To move quietly. To know your worth without advertising it. To own something no one could see coming. I closed the file. Made a note. And for the first time since it all began, I smiled. Not because I'd won. But because I hadn't disappeared. I had simply changed direction. Like wind. Peace doesn't arrive like a celebration. It seeps in, quietly, humbly, when you've finally stopped defending your right to exist. There are moments now when I forget it all. Not in the sense of amnesia, but in that strange way the body remembers pain long after the mind has let it go. I'll walk into a room, answer a message, make coffee, and for a moment, I feel like I never knew him. Like Daniel was just a shadow that passed across a younger version of me. That feeling used to scare me. Now, I see it for what it is. Healing. Not as a grand transformation. But as a slow erosion of everything that was never truly mine. Some evenings, I walk the river path after work. No music. No phone. Just the soft rhythm of my steps and the low hum of traffic beyond the trees. There's a bench near the water where I like to sit and write, sometimes with purpose, sometimes with nothing at all. One night, a woman sat next to me. Older. Maybe 60. Dressed simply. She looked like someone who knew how to survive winters without complaint. We didn't speak for a long time. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "I used to think endings were things that happened to you. Turns out, you have to make them yourself." I didn't respond. I just folded the page I'd been writing on and slipped it into my notebook. Because I knew exactly what she meant. In the months that followed the divorce, I began measuring my life differently. Not in wins or titles or applause, but in stillness. In the mornings I didn't wake up anxious. In the emails I didn't feel the need to reread 6 times before hitting send. In the people who reached out, not because they needed something, but because they remembered me. And in what I chose to let in. The walls of my apartment remain mostly bare. Not because I'm waiting, but because I don't need them filled to feel full. There are no traces of Daniel. Not because I erased him, but because he no longer defines the architecture of my memory. I did keep one thing, though. A photo. Taken 3 years ago. Not of him. Just me. At a company retreat, standing near a lake, half smiling at the camera with sunglasses pushed into my hair. I keep it in the back of my drawer. Not to remember him. To remember her. The woman I was before she softened every part of herself to keep someone else from falling apart. Sometimes I look at her and think, how could you not see? And other times, I'm just proud she made it back. I started mentoring younger women at the firm. Nothing formal. Just quiet support. The kind I never had when I was 28 and thought competence was the same as invincibility. One of them, a sharp, ambitious analyst named Mariah, asked me once how I stayed calm through pressure. I told her the truth. I said, I've survived things that didn't announce themselves until they'd already eaten half my life. A spreadsheet doesn't scare me. She laughed. But I think she understood. Grace and I still talk. Not often, but with warmth. The kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance. She sends me book recommendations. I send her obscure cookie recipes she never makes. It's enough. Last month, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. Anika. It came through a professional networking platform. Short. Civil, I don't expect a response. I just wanted to say thank you. You were right to do what you did. He lied to both of us. I've moved on. I hope you have too. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty. Just completion. She wasn't my wound to hold anymore. Neither was he. There's no poetic justice in how things turned out for Daniel. He didn't end up in prison. He didn't lose everything. But from what Grace tells me, he lost the illusion. The doors don't open as easily now. The charm doesn't convert the way it used to. And that's its own kind of justice. Not dramatic. Just permanent. I'm not angry anymore. Not because he deserves forgiveness. But because I deserve peace. It took me 34 years to understand that forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about walking away without carrying the wreckage on your back. There's a kind of freedom in that. A softness I never expected to feel again. The other day, I passed a flower stand near the corner of Boylston and Arlington. Tulips. Bright red. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I bought a bundle. Not to remember him. To reclaim them. I placed them in a vase by my window, where the late afternoon sun touches the petals just right. They're not apologies anymore. They're mine. And that was how it ended. Not with revenge. Not with noise. But with clarity. And a woman, alone in her apartment, placing tulips in water like someone who finally remembered her own worth.